Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's stories begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And a little note before we begin. You may notice a few brief ads in the first 10 minutes, but after that, the rest of the video is completely ad-free. Just you, the silence, and the stories. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the night carry you. If you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. In January of 1961, during one of the most tense periods of the Cold War, a routine military flight turned into one of the most frightening near disasters in American history. At the time, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a constant standoff. Nuclear weapons were not just theoretical threats. They were actively loaded onto aircraft as part of what was known as airborne alert missions. The idea was simple and terrifying at the same time. If war broke out suddenly, American bombers already in the air could respond immediately. That constant readiness was meant to deter attack, but it also meant that nuclear weapons were frequently flying above American soil. One of those aircraft was a B-52 Stratofortress bomber assigned to Seymour Johnson Air Force Base near Goldsboro, North Carolina. The B-52 was a massive aircraft, built to carry heavy payloads across long distances. On that particular night, the bomber was carrying two Mark 39 hydrogen bombs. Each bomb was far more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Together, they represented destruction on a scale that is hard to fully grasp. The flight began like many others. The crew had trained extensively. Procedures were routine. The mission was part of a broader system designed to keep nuclear forces ready at all times. At some point during the mission, the aircraft attempted an air-to-air refueling operation. These maneuvers were common and necessary for long-duration flights. During or shortly after refueling, the crew was informed that there appeared to be a fuel leak in the right wing of the aircraft. Fuel leaks in large aircraft are serious but not automatically catastrophic. The crew followed protocol. They initially climbed and moved the aircraft over the Atlantic Ocean to burn off excess fuel. Reducing weight would make landing safer. At first, the situation did not seem beyond control. But as minutes passed, it became clear that the leak was far worse than expected. Fuel was escaping at an alarming rate. The structural integrity of the wing began to weaken. Command instructed the crew to return to base at Goldsboro as quickly as possible. The aircraft turned back toward North Carolina. During the flight home, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The bomber began to shake violently. The stress on the airframe increased. A B-52 is large and powerful, but even it cannot withstand unlimited structural failure. The crew felt the aircraft breaking apart around them. Realizing the plane was coming apart in midair, the captain made the decision that no pilot ever wants to make. He ordered the crew to bail out. Time was limited. Some crew members were able to eject or escape successfully. 3 of them, however, could not. When the aircraft finally broke apart over rural farmland near Goldsboro, those 3 men lost their lives. The others descended by parachute into the dark countryside below. As the aircraft disintegrated, the 2 nuclear bombs it carried were released unintentionally. This was not a controlled drop. The breakup of the aircraft caused the weapons to separate from the fuselage. One of the bombs deployed its parachute exactly as it was designed to do during a planned release. That detail is both astonishing and deeply unsettling. The bomb behaved as if it were part of an operational mission. The parachute slowed its descent. It drifted downward through the cold night air and eventually became entangled in trees. The bomb ended up dangling just a short distance above the ground in a rural area. Farmers would later discover how close their land had come to destruction. The second bomb did not descend so gently. Without a properly deployed parachute, it fell at high speed and plunged deep into muddy farmland. The impact buried much of it underground. What investigators discovered afterward remains one of the most shocking aspects of the incident. Nuclear weapons are designed with multiple safety mechanisms. These are meant to prevent accidental detonation. In the case of the bomb that descended by parachute, 3 out of its 4 arming mechanisms were triggered during the aircraft's breakup and fall. That means the bomb had gone through nearly the entire sequence required to detonate. Only a single low-voltage safety switch prevented the weapon from exploding. One small electrical component stood between the eastern United States and catastrophic destruction. Experts later stated that the bomb was many times more powerful than the device dropped on Hiroshima. If it had detonated, much of eastern North Carolina could have been devastated. Fallout could have spread across major cities along the East Coast, depending on weather conditions. The second bomb, buried in mud, also presented enormous danger. Recovery teams had to move quickly. Military and bomb disposal experts were dispatched to the crash site. Their mission was clear but terrifying. Secure 2 nuclear weapons, determine their condition, and prevent any risk of detonation or radioactive contamination. The bomb that was hanging from the parachute was located first. Recovery crews approached carefully. Even damaged, it remained potentially lethal. Specialists began searching for the safe/arm switch, a critical component that determines whether a weapon is in a safe state or ready to detonate. According to later accounts, when they located the switch, there was a brief exchange that captured the tension of the moment. A crew member reportedly informed his commanding officer that they had found the switch. At first, that sounded like good news. But then came the realization, and the switch was set to arm. That meant the weapon had moved through its activation sequence far enough to be considered live. The room for error had been razor thin. The bomb squad worked methodically. They removed the nuclear core from the weapon to eliminate the immediate threat of explosion. The remaining components were handled with care. The second bomb proved more difficult. Because it had plunged deep into soft farmland at high speed, parts of it were buried dozens of feet underground. Teams excavated carefully, recovering as much as possible. Some components were never fully retrieved. In the end, officials decided that certain buried pieces would remain underground permanently. To prevent future disturbance, the U.S. government purchased the land directly above the buried components. The area was fenced and restricted. A small marker now stands there, quiet and unassuming, in the middle of farmland. It does not immediately convey how close the country came to disaster. What makes the Goldsboro incident so unsettling is not just the technical failure. It is the combination of human decision-making, mechanical malfunction, and pure chance. The crew followed procedure when they noticed the fuel leak. They attempted to manage the situation responsibly. Yet the structural failure of the aircraft triggered a chain of events no one intended. For audiences in the United States, United Kingdom, and Canada, this story serves as a powerful reminder of how fragile safety can be during periods of military tension. During the Cold War, nuclear weapons were handled under strict protocols. Yet this incident shows that even multiple safeguards can come dangerously close to failing. The fact that 3 out of 4 arming mechanisms activated in midair still surprises many experts today. It reveals how real the risk of accidental nuclear detonation was during that era. People often imagine nuclear war as something triggered intentionally by political leaders. But the Goldsboro incident shows that accidents could have caused unimaginable destruction without any deliberate decision to launch. It also highlights the skill and courage of the recovery teams. Approaching a live nuclear weapon requires calm under extreme pressure. These were not cinematic heroes in dramatic slow motion. They were trained professionals working in cold mud and farmland, focused on switches, wires, and procedures. Their steady hands and clear thinking prevented further escalation. Luck played a role, too. The low-voltage switch that ultimately stopped detonation was never meant to be the final barrier. It was one layer among several, yet it became the last line of defense. That small component did not fail. Whether one calls it engineering, reliability, or sheer fortune, it made the difference. The surrounding communities were largely unaware of how close they had come to catastrophe. Farmers continued their work. Families went about their routines. News coverage at the time did not fully explain the danger. Much of the information remained classified for years. Only decades later did more detailed reports reveal just how narrow the margin had been. Thinking about what could have happened is sobering. A nuclear explosion in North Carolina in 1961 would have reshaped American history. The loss of life would have been enormous. The political consequences during the Cold War could have triggered international escalation. Trust in military systems might have collapsed overnight. Instead, the disaster remained a near miss. The bombs were left one step away from detonation. The eastern seaboard was spared. The country moved on, mostly unaware. The incident became a quiet entry in military archives, known mainly to historians and defense analysts. Today, the Goldsboro site appears calm. Fields stretch under open sky. There is no visible sign of how close those acres came to being at the center of a nuclear explosion. Yet beneath that quiet landscape lies a story of mechanical failure, split-second decisions, and extraordinary restraint. The event also raises larger questions about nuclear safety worldwide. If such a close call could happen during a routine flight, what other near misses have occurred? Declassified documents from various countries show that accidents and false alarms were more common during the Cold War than most people realize. Each one carried the potential for irreversible consequences. For modern readers in North America and Europe, the story feels almost surreal. It sounds like fiction, something written for a thriller novel. But it happened. A bomber broke apart over rural farmland. 2 hydrogen bombs fell from the sky. Safety mechanisms failed in sequence, and one small electrical switch prevented devastation. The Goldsboro nuclear incident stands as one of the clearest examples of how thin the line can be between stability and catastrophe. It reminds us that systems built by humans are never flawless. It underscores the importance of constant review, safety improvements, and transparency. In the end, the United States was spared from nuclear destruction that night through a combination of trained professionals doing their jobs and an element of chance that cannot be ignored. The bomb squad secured the weapons. The government contained the site. Life continued. But the lesson remains. Sometimes history changes because of bold decisions or major battles. Other times, it changes because a small, low-voltage switch holds when everything else fails. When people talk about haunted campuses in the United States, certain places come up again and again. Old universities tend to collect stories the way they collect ivy on brick walls. One of the schools that has always carried that kind of reputation is Kenyon College in Ohio. It's a small, historic liberal arts college with stone buildings, long wooded paths, and dormitories that have been standing for generations. On the surface, it looks peaceful and traditional. But if you spend enough time there, especially late at night, you start hearing stories that don't quite fit into the calm picture. One of the most talked about stories involves a boy with a red hat. The strange thing about the story isn't just the sighting itself. It's how consistently it repeats across different classes of students. These seniors who are about to graduate will mention him casually, like he's part of campus folklore. Then a new group of freshmen arrives knowing nothing about the legend, and someone will ask, "Who's that kid with the red hat?" That repetition is what unsettles people. The story goes that for years, students have reported seeing a young boy wearing a red hat wandering through certain parts of campus. Sometimes he's seen near dormitories, other times near older academic buildings. He doesn't speak. He doesn't interact. He just appears. Then he's gone. What makes it eerie is that Kenyon College isn't a place where children normally wander alone, especially at night. It's a college campus, not a family neighborhood. Students who claim to see him often describe the same details. A child, maybe elementary school age, wearing a red cap. Sometimes he's standing at the end of a hallway. Sometimes he's near a staircase. He doesn't look threatening. He doesn't look injured. He just looks out of place. When people approach him or try to call out, he disappears, as if he was never there. The most unsettling part is how unaware the witnesses usually are of the legend before they see him. A freshman, brand new to campus, might mention seeing a child late at night and ask others about it. That's when older students will exchange looks and say, "Did he have a red hat?" That moment of realization sticks with people. It's easy to dismiss stories like this as imagination or shared suggestion. College campuses are full of stress, lack of sleep, and overactive imaginations. Students stay up late studying. They walk across dimly lit paths at night. And shadows stretch differently under old streetlights, but when the same description surfaces over and over again across years, it becomes harder to brush aside completely. Kenyon's age adds to the atmosphere. Many of its buildings are historic. Some date back to the early 19th century. Old wood floors creak. Pipes rattle. Doors shift slightly with changes in temperature. It's the kind of place where sounds carry in strange ways. And when you combine architecture like that with stories passed down through generations of students, you get an environment that feels layered with memory. Then there is the second story, the one that unsettles even people who don't believe in ghosts. In the summer of what many recall as around the year 2000, campus security received a call that would stay with them for years. It was the middle of summer break. Most students were gone. Certain dorms were completely closed and locked for the season. No residents, no electricity, no running water. Just empty hallways and sealed doors waiting for fall. Late one night, security received a call reporting screaming, coming from one of these unoccupied dorm buildings. Not faint noise, not distant shouting. According to the report, it was a woman screaming at the top of her lungs. The description often includes the word banshee, like something raw and piercing that echoes through walls. Security officers didn't hesitate. Even if the building was supposed to be empty, a scream like that demands a response. They rushed to the dorm immediately. From the outside, everything looked normal. Doors were locked, windows were closed. There were no signs of forced entry. They unlocked the main entrance and entered the building. What they found inside only deepened the mystery. The hallways were empty, just as expected. But when they reached the bathrooms, all the showers were running at full blast, water pouring out as if someone had turned every knob at once. This was a building that had supposedly been shut down for the summer. No power, no active plumbing. The sound of water hitting tile in an otherwise silent building must have been unnerving. There was no one there. No footsteps. No movement. Just the steady rush of multiple showers running in empty stalls. Security officers reportedly shut off the water and left the building shaken. It's one thing to respond to a false alarm. It's another to find physical evidence that something had happened in a space that should have been untouched. A couple of hours later, it happened again. Another call, another scream. Same building. This time when security returned, I believe the showers were not running again, but the sense of dread was even stronger. The locks were still intact. No signs of break-in. No explanation for how a closed, dark building could produce such intense noise. The officers who responded were deeply affected by the experience. According to people who knew them, they were not the type to scare easily. Campus security deals with all kinds of situations: rowdy students, medical emergencies, false alarms. But this was different. It didn't fit into any familiar category. After that summer, the building developed a reputation among staff. The security officers who had responded reportedly avoided talking about it. If someone asked, they would shut down the conversation quickly. Not in a playful way. Not like someone telling a ghost story for fun. It was more like a door closing. A topic they didn't want to revisit. Whether the cause was mechanical malfunction, prank, or something else entirely. The emotional impact on those who experienced it was real. Fear doesn't need a supernatural explanation to feel genuine. If you walk into an empty, dark building and hear something that shouldn't be possible, your body reacts before your brain can rationalize. For students at Kenyon, these stories become part of the campus culture. You hear them during late-night conversations in dorm rooms, during orientation week when upperclassmen share things you should know, during Halloween events when people talk about the most haunted places on campus. Some laugh it off. Others secretly avoid certain buildings at night. What makes these stories linger is not just the details, but the consistency. The red-hatted boys seen across years. The locked dorm with screaming and showers running. The security officers who won't discuss it. In the United States, college campuses often become containers for collective memory. Students come and go, but stories remain. Each class adds its own layer, but certain legends endure. Kenyon College, with its long history and old architecture, feels like the perfect setting for that kind of folklore. There are rational explanations for many of these incidents. Plumbing systems can malfunction in surprising ways. Old buildings can amplify or distort sounds. Human perception can be influenced by suggestion. And once a story becomes known, people may interpret ambiguous experiences through that lens. But even when you account for logic, there's still something about the repetition that makes people pause, especially when new students describe the same child with the red hat before they've even heard the legend. Whether haunted or not, the emotional weight of these stories is undeniable. For the security officers, the experience reportedly left lasting anxiety. For students, the legends shape how they experience campus after dark. Walking through an old stone hallway at midnight feels different when you've heard about a silent boy who appears at the end of it. Hearing water pipes knock in a building feels more intense when you remember the story of showers running in an empty dorm. In the end, Kenyon College remains what it has always been. A respected academic institution with beautiful grounds and a long history. But like many historic places, It carries stories that blur the line between folklore and fear. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, there's something powerful about shared experiences that stretch across generations. The red hat, the screaming, the showers, the silence from those who were there. Those details are what keep the stories alive. And maybe that's the most haunting part of all. My former spouse and their brother grew up deeply involved in the Boy Scouts in Minnesota. Scouting was not just an after-school activity for them. It shaped their weekends, their summers, and even their friendships. Camping trips were constant, and they were the kind of kids who counted down the days until the next excursion. Minnesota is known for its lakes, forests, and long, quiet stretches of wilderness, so there was never a shortage of places to explore. They traveled across state lines often, especially into Wisconsin, visiting state parks and wooded areas that felt endless and untouched. For them, those trips meant bonfires, mosquito bites, damp tents in the morning, and the kind of tiredness that only comes from being outdoors all day. One particular trip has always stayed in my mind. They were camping near Milwaukee, Wisconsin, during the summer of 1991. At the time, they were just focused on earning badges and spending time with friends. The world outside their campsite felt far away. But that was the same night that Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested after one of his victims managed to escape and flagged down police. News like that didn't spread instantly the way it does now. There were no smartphones buzzing with alerts. Word traveled slowly, usually by television or radio. In a campground full of families and scouts, most people likely had no idea that something horrifying had just unfolded not too far away. Looking back, the timing feels chilling. It's one of those coincidences that doesn't mean anything on paper, yet still leaves a strange feeling behind. My former father-in-law was on that trip as one of the adult supervisors. He was a complicated man, and much of his personal life was hidden from the world at that time. In the early 1990s, especially in parts of the Midwest that were not large cities, being openly gay could cost someone their job, their reputation, or even their safety. He lived in the closet. To most people, he appeared to be a typical married father involved in his son's activities. But privately, he carried a secret that shaped many of his choices. During camping trips, he had a habit that people noticed but didn't question too deeply. He would announce that he needed to go into town for supplies. Sometimes it was extra ice, forgotten groceries, or something minor that could easily wait until morning. He would be gone for hours. At the time, most people assumed he just enjoyed a quiet break from the chaos of supervising boys in the woods. Later, it became clearer that those trips into town were often opportunities for him to meet other men discreetly, to have a drink, to feel seen for who he really was, even if only for a short time. For reasons no one can fully explain, he did not make one of those trips that particular night near Milwaukee. He stayed at the campsite. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he didn't feel like driving. Maybe it was pure chance. It's impossible to know. But that small decision has always lingered in my thoughts. Jeffrey Dahmer's victims were mostly young men, many of them vulnerable, many of them fitting a certain physical type. My former father-in-law's own preferences, from what I later understood, overlapped with that general look. It creates an uncomfortable mental picture, the kind that makes you pause. The likelihood that they would have crossed paths was extremely small. Milwaukee is not a tiny town, and Dahmer's crimes were horrifying but also specific. Still, when you place two realities side by side, The secret life of a closeted man seeking connection and a serial killer targeting men in that same city. The mind can't help but imagine the narrow spaces where chance operates. It was the early 1990s. There were fewer safe spaces for gay men, fewer public conversations, and much more risk in simply trying to meet someone. The secrecy itself could create vulnerability. I sometimes think about how easily life can tilt one direction or another because of a single choice. If he had decided to drive into town that night, would anything have happened? Probably not. Most likely, he would have met someone, had a drink, returned quietly, and no one would have known. But the knowledge that such a predator was active in that exact place, at that exact time, adds an uneasy layer to the memory. It's not about drama. It's about proximity. Being close to something terrible without knowing it. Being one ordinary decision away from a completely different future. For my former spouse and their brother, that camping trip was probably remembered for simple reasons. The smell of pine trees, the taste of burnt marshmallows, the sound of other scouts laughing in the dark. They may not even recall the date clearly, but when I learned the timeline years later, it shifted how I thought about it. It reminded me how often danger exists just beyond our awareness. We move through our lives thinking we understand our surroundings, yet so much remains hidden. There is also something deeply human about my former father-in-law's situation. He lived during a time when honesty about his identity felt impossible. The closet was not just a metaphor. It was a survival strategy. His trips into town were small acts of rebellion and relief. They were also risky. Not just because of someone like Dahmer, but because exposure alone could have destroyed his family life. That double life must have been exhausting, smiling at the campfire, teaching boys how to tie knots, all while carrying secrets that shaped every decision. When people talk about proximity to infamous crimes, they often focus on physical closeness. But there is also emotional closeness. The awareness that someone in your orbit might have unknowingly brushed up against something monstrous. It creates a strange mix of relief and discomfort. A relief that nothing happened. Discomfort that it could have, even if the odds were slim. I think about how many people were living their normal lives in Milwaukee that night. How many were at restaurants, bars, parks, or campsites, unaware that history was quietly shifting. When news finally broke, it must have felt surreal. The idea that a serial killer had been operating in plain sight for so long shook communities across the country. For those camping near the city, it likely added a chill to what had been an ordinary summer trip. Over time, the story has become less about Dahmer himself and more about the fragile nature of chance. About how secrecy, geography, and timing can intersect in ways that are almost too close for comfort. It reminds me that our lives are often protected by randomness, by the fact that we stayed in instead of going out, by the fact that we took one road instead of another. The camping trip near Milwaukee stands as a quiet example of that. A moment when the world felt safe and contained within the circle of a campfire, while something dark was unfolding not far away. A reminder that history does not announce itself in advance. It simply happens, often just down the road, while we are busy living our ordinary lives. My grandmother's story lives in a completely different space, yet it carries a similar weight of survival and chance. She was a Holocaust survivor. Growing up, we did not hear many detailed stories from her about the camps. Silence often surrounded that part of her life, but silence does not mean absence. It showed itself in other ways. In the middle of the night, her cries would echo through the house. She would wail in her sleep, sometimes shouting in a language I did not understand as a child. Even when she was awake, certain sounds or smells could pull her somewhere far away in her mind. As a child, I did not fully grasp what she had endured. I only knew that something terrible had happened long before I was born, and that it still lived inside her. Trauma does not disappear when an event ends. It reshapes a person from the inside out. My grandmother carried that reshaping for the rest of her life. She survived camps, hiding, starvation, fear, and loss. Yet she rarely described those experiences directly. There was one story she told more than once. It was not told lightly. She would speak slowly, sometimes pausing as if the memory itself required effort to lift. She described a woman who had been imprisoned in the same camp. Conditions were brutal. People were sick, starving, beaten, and exhausted beyond what most of us can imagine. Death was common. Bodies were often handled quickly and without dignity. At some point, this other woman was believed to be dead. Maybe she had collapsed. Maybe she was too weak to move. In such conditions, it did not take much for someone to appear lifeless. Guards or workers gathered bodies and placed them in piles, waiting to dispose of them in pits where they would be burned. The scale of death made individual identity almost disappear. My grandmother was assigned to some kind of night duty. She never described the task in great detail, but it required her to be awake when most others were not. It was during one of those nights that she saw something that never left her mind. From a pile of bodies meant for burning, she saw movement. The woman who had been thought dead slowly pushed herself up. Imagine the shock of that moment. In a place defined by death, a body rising from a heap of corpses would have looked almost unreal. The woman began to sneak away. She moved quietly, likely aware that discovery would mean immediate execution. My grandmother watched. She did not shout. She did not draw attention. In that environment, even a small sound could cost multiple lives. She simply witnessed it. A human being clawing back toward life in the narrowest window of opportunity. My grandmother believed the woman was probably shot soon after. Escape from such camps was nearly impossible. Guards were armed. Perimeters were controlled. But the image of her rising from that pile remained. It was a moment of defiance against the machinery of death. Even if it ended tragically, it proved that life can flicker stubbornly, even when surrounded by horror. As a child, hearing that story unsettled me deeply. The idea of someone being mistaken for dead and thrown among bodies was beyond anything I could process. But as I grew older, I understood why that story mattered to my grandmother. It was not just about fear. It was about resilience. It was about how thin the line between life and death had been for everyone there. Her nightmares made more sense in that context. She had seen things that most people are never forced to see. She had smelled burning flesh. She had heard screams. She had hidden to survive. Even decades later, her body remembered. Trauma lives in the nervous system. It shows up in sleep, in sudden tears, in quiet moments when the past pushes forward. For those of us in later generations, the Holocaust can sometimes feel like history contained in textbooks, dates, numbers, statistics. But for her, it was not history. It was memory. It was lived reality. It shaped how she saw the world. It shaped how she loved, how she feared, how she protected her family. The story of the woman rising from the pile of bodies stands out because it captures something essential about survival. Survival is not always dramatic or heroic in the way movies portray it. Sometimes it is simply a breath taken when no one expects it. A movement in the dark, a refusal of the body to fully surrender. I often think about how my grandmother carried both unimaginable horror and ordinary tenderness. She could bake, laugh, tell jokes, and also wake up screaming from dreams of the camps. Those two realities coexisted. That is the complexity of trauma survivors. They are not defined only by what happened to them, yet what happened to them never fully disappears. When I place these two stories side by side, the camping trip near Milwaukee and my grandmother's memory from the camp, they share a quiet theme. Both involve proximity to horror. One is about unknowingly being close to a serial killer. The other is about living inside a system designed for destruction. Both remind me that safety is often more fragile than we realize. At the same time, both stories are about survival. My former father-in-law survived that night simply by staying at the campsite. My grandmother survived years of brutality. The woman who rose from the pile fought for survival, even if only for a few moments. These stories are not about sensational fear. They are about the narrow margins that separate ordinary life from tragedy. For audiences in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada, these stories resonate because they touch on universal themes: the randomness of danger, the weight of hidden identity, the endurance of trauma, the quiet, everyday choices that shape whether we walk towards safety or risk. I carry these stories not as dramatic legends, but as reminders. Reminders that history is never as distant as it seems, that the past lives inside people, that coincidence can feel eerie without being supernatural, and that even in the darkest settings, human beings continue to reach for life, sometimes rising from places where no one expects them to move again. There is a case that has stayed with me for a long time, not because of shock value, but because of how deeply cruel human beings can be when there is no empathy, no accountability, and no one stepping in to stop them. The victim was a young woman, often described in reports as someone working as an exotic dancer, though many accounts suggest she was simply a teenager trying to live her life. Regardless of how she was labeled, she was a human being. She had a family. She had a future. And what happened to her remains one of the most disturbing crimes I have ever read about. She was taken and held hostage by a group of men. They did not just assault her once and leave her. They kept her captive for weeks. That fact alone is horrifying. For an entire month, she was trapped in a space where she had no control, no safety, and no one coming to rescue her. The men treated her as if she were not a person at all. They stripped her of dignity, freedom, and basic human rights. Instead of seeing her fear or pain, they treated her suffering as entertainment. One of the men involved had a girlfriend who was only 13 years old, while he himself was around 30. That detail adds another layer of sickness to the situation. The imbalance of power, the manipulation, and the normalization of abuse were already present in his own life. That same twisted mindset extended into what they did to their victim. At one point, they forced her to eat human waste. It is difficult to even write that sentence. The level of humiliation and cruelty behind such an act shows a complete absence of compassion. It was not only physical abuse, it was psychological destruction. They tortured her in ways that are hard to fully comprehend. They burned the skin on her feet so severely that she could barely stand or move. Feet are what allow someone to run, to escape, to feel grounded. By destroying that part of her body, they were removing even the smallest possibility of her fleeing. They beat her repeatedly, using her body like a punching bag. She endured injuries over and over again. It was not a sudden crime committed in a moment of rage. It was sustained violence carried out day after day. Imagine living through that for a month. Not knowing if today would be worse than yesterday. Not knowing if you would survive the night. The fear alone would have been overwhelming. Humans are not built to live under constant threat. Our minds and bodies break down under that kind of pressure. She endured pain, starvation, fear, and isolation for weeks before her body finally gave out. When she died, the cruelty did not end. Instead of showing even a small amount of regret or humanity, the men focused on covering up what they had done. They dismembered her body in an attempt to hide the evidence. They cooked parts of her remains in a pot on the stove. The fact that they prepared noodles nearby, as if this were an ordinary day in the kitchen, is almost impossible to understand. It speaks to how disconnected they were from the reality of their actions. To them, it was not a life they had taken. It was a problem they needed to get rid of. One of the most disturbing details reported was that they placed her decapitated head inside a Hello Kitty doll and sewed it back up. Hello Kitty is a symbol of childhood, innocence, and comfort. To use something so innocent as part of such a horrific act shows a disturbing level of distortion. It was as if they wanted to hide violence inside something cheerful, something soft and harmless. That contrast makes the act even more unsettling. For people in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, or anywhere else, stories like this can feel distant, like something that happens far away or in another culture. But the truth is that cruelty like this is not limited by geography. Every country has cases where vulnerable individuals are targeted and abused. What makes this particular case stand out is the length of time it continued and the number of opportunities there were for someone to intervene. There were people who likely heard noises. There were probably moments when someone could have asked questions. Sometimes communities miss warning signs because they do not want to believe something that terrible could be happening next door. It is easier to assume everything is fine. It is easier not to get involved. But that silence can allow abuse to continue. Another painful part of this case is how young she was. Youth often comes with trust. Many young people believe others will not harm them. They believe they can reason with people. They believe someone will step in if things get dangerous. When that trust is betrayed in such an extreme way, it shakes the foundation of what we think about humanity. The involvement of a 13-year-old girl in the situation also raises serious concerns. She herself was a child, connected to a much older man who clearly had no respect for boundaries or morality. When adults normalize violence, younger people around them can become desensitized. They may participate without fully understanding the consequences. That does not excuse their actions, but it shows how cycles of abuse can spread. What haunts me most is the idea of that month. A month is long. Think about what you do in a month. You celebrate birthdays. You go to work. You make plans. You watch seasons change slightly. While the rest of the world moved forward, she was trapped in a nightmare that did not end until her body could no longer survive. The psychological damage inflicted during that time must have been immense. Victims of prolonged captivity often experience fear that never leaves them. They may begin to dissociate, separating their minds from their bodies to cope with pain. They may cling to small hopes, like hearing footsteps in the hallway and thinking it could be help. Every passing hour might have felt like a lifetime. Cases like this force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human behavior. Some people are capable of extreme cruelty when they feel powerful and believe they will not be caught. Group dynamics can make it worse. When multiple perpetrators are involved, they may encourage each other, pushing the violence further than one individual might have gone alone. They feed off each other's lack of empathy. It is also important to remember that she was more than what happened to her. Media coverage often focuses on the gruesome details, repeating them over and over. But she had a name, a personality, dreams, and relationships. She was someone's daughter. She likely had friends who laughed with her, teachers who taught her, memories from childhood. Those parts of her life deserve attention too. In the aftermath of crimes like this, people often ask how such evil can exist. Some look for psychological explanations. Others blame culture, upbringing, or mental illness. While those factors can play a role, they do not fully explain deliberate, sustained cruelty. At some point, individuals make choices. They choose to ignore someone's suffering. They choose to continue even when they know it is wrong. The cover-up attempts show awareness. They knew what they did was criminal. They knew they would face consequences. Instead of confessing or showing remorse, they focused on hiding evidence. That reveals intent and understanding. It was not confusion. It was calculation. For audiences in Western countries, this case also highlights the importance of systems that protect vulnerable people. Strong laws, responsive law enforcement, community awareness, and support services can make a difference. When someone goes missing, quick action matters. When abuse is suspected, intervention matters. Silence can be deadly. There is also a larger conversation about how society views women, especially those labeled as dancers or sex workers. Sometimes victims are judged based on their profession or lifestyle, as if that makes them less worthy of sympathy. It does not. Every person deserves safety and dignity, regardless of how they earn a living. Reading about this case can leave a heavy feeling. It challenges the belief that most people are inherently good. At the same time, it can also inspire a deeper commitment to protecting others. Awareness is uncomfortable, but it can motivate change. Communities can learn to pay attention to warning signs. Friends can check in more often. Families can create spaces where people feel safe asking for help. Another painful reality is how long trauma lasts for the victim's family. Losing someone in any way is devastating. Losing them through violence is even harder. The unanswered questions, the mental images, the anger, and the grief can last a lifetime. Families often replay the timeline, wondering if there was something they could have done differently. That weight is unfair, but it is real. In the end, this story is not just about horror. It is about accountability, empathy, and vigilance. It is about recognizing that cruelty thrives in secrecy. It is about understanding that bystanders have power, even if they do not realize it. And it is about honoring the victim by remembering her as a person, not just a headline. When we hear about crimes like this, the natural reaction is disbelief. How could someone do that? How could others stand by? Those questions may never have complete answers, but we can respond by strengthening the values that prevent such acts: compassion, intervention, and respect for human life. The details of what happened to her are difficult to process, and they should be. They are not meant to entertain. They are meant to remind us of the consequences when empathy disappears. In a world that often feels chaotic, the simplest acts of care and responsibility can make the biggest difference. Her story remains one of the most disturbing examples of prolonged abuse and cruelty, but it also serves as a warning. It reminds us that evil often hides in ordinary spaces, behind closed doors in apartments and houses that look just like any other. Awareness, education, and courage to speak up are some of the few tools we have to stop it. No one should endure what she endured. No family should have to learn the details of such a loss. And no community should ignore signs that something is wrong. Remembering her story is painful, but forgetting it would mean ignoring the lessons it carries. Some stories don't involve crime or evil intent. There's no villain, no long chain of events, no mystery to solve. They're simply accidents, ordinary moments that shift into tragedy in seconds. And somehow, those are the ones that can linger the longest. The one that has always stayed with me is about a toddler in a kitchen. Just an everyday evening, a parent cooking dinner, a pot of noodles boiling on the stove. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic, just the kind of scene that happens in millions of homes across the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, everywhere. The mother was standing at the stove, focused on making dinner. The pot was filled with water, rolling at a full boil, steam rising, bubbles breaking the surface. That familiar sound of water churning before pasta goes in. It's such a normal sound that most of us don't even register it anymore. The toddler was nearby. At that age, they're curious about everything. They want to see what you're doing. They want to touch, to climb, to reach. They don't understand danger the way adults do. They see a counter or a stove and think it's something to explore. At some point, the child reached up and grabbed the edge of the stove or possibly the oven door. It only takes a second. Just a small amount of weight in the wrong place. The stove tilted forward slightly. Not enough for an adult to notice ahead of time, but enough. The pot shifted. And then the water came down. Boiling water moves fast. There's no pause, no warning. 1 second, it's contained in a pot. The next, it's pouring over skin. The child was right there. The water spilled over her body before anyone could react. The mother rushed to her immediately. Instinct took over. She grabbed her child, trying to brush the water off, trying to cool her skin. The screams must have been unbearable. Anyone who has heard a child cry in real pain knows that sound is different. It's sharp, it's panicked, it cuts straight through you. The mother focused on what she could see. Red skin, blistering, the areas that were clearly burned. She likely ran to the sink, maybe tried to use cool water, maybe grabbed towels. In those moments, your brain narrows. You're not thinking logically. You're thinking, stop the pain, help my child, do something. What she didn't realize right away was that the boiling water hadn't just run off the child's body. It had soaked into her diaper. A diaper is designed to absorb liquid. That's its purpose. It holds moisture against the skin. But in this case, that design became part of the tragedy. The hot water was trapped inside the padding. It stayed pressed against the most sensitive part of her body. While the mother worked frantically to treat the visible burns on her arms or chest, the soaked diaper continued to hold scalding heat against her private area. By the time they realized what had happened and removed it, the damage had already been done. Third-degree burns are not minor injuries. They destroy layers of skin. They can require surgeries, grafts, long hospital stays. For a toddler, the pain and long-term effects can be overwhelming. Even thinking about it makes your chest tighten. What makes this story so haunting isn't cruelty. It isn't neglect. It's that it happened in a moment of ordinary life. A parent cooking dinner, a child being curious, a split second of imbalance, and then the layer that cuts even deeper. The mother didn't think to remove the diaper immediately because she was focused on what she could see. She was reacting the way many of us would. She saw burned skin and tried to treat it. She didn't realize that something hidden was causing more damage. That's the part that gives people cold chills. The idea that even when you are trying your absolute best, in an emergency, you can still miss something critical. For parents, this story hits especially hard, because every parent has had that moment where something almost happened. The near miss with a hot pan. The child who reached for a curling iron. The time a cup of coffee was too close to the edge of the table. We don't like to think about how quickly things can go wrong in kitchens. But kitchens are full of hazards. Boiling water, hot oil, sharp knives, open flames. Adults navigate them without thinking. Toddlers see them as fascinating. In North America and the UK, scald burns are actually one of the most common injuries for young children. Pediatric hospitals regularly treat burns from hot drinks, bath water, soup, and pasta. It's not rare. That's what makes it even more unsettling. This isn't a once-in-a-generation freak accident. It's something that can happen in an ordinary home on an ordinary Tuesday. The emotional weight of it is enormous. You can imagine the mother replaying the moment over and over in her mind. If I had moved the pot farther back, if I had turned the handle inward, if I had kept her in a high chair, if I had taken the diaper off sooner. That kind of guilt can be crushing, even when it was clearly an accident. And that's what makes the story linger. Not because of gore or shock, but because it reveals how fragile safety really is. It shows how quickly love and routine can collide with disaster. When people say a story gives them chills, it's often because it exposes vulnerability. We like to believe that being attentive and caring is enough to prevent harm. Most of the time it is. But sometimes timing and physics and childhood curiosity line up in ways no one anticipates. There's also something deeply human about the mistake with the diaper. It wasn't ignorance. It was tunnel vision. In emergencies, the brain narrows focus to visible threats. If you see blistering skin, you treat blistering skin. You don't immediately think about fabric holding heat underneath. And yet that small detail changed the outcome. Stories like this often spread quietly, passed from parent to parent as cautionary reminders. Not to blame, but to inform. Turn pot handles inward. Keep hot liquids away from edges. Be aware of absorbent clothing that can trap heat. But even with all the precautions in the world, accidents can still happen. What makes this story especially painful is imagining that moment afterward. The hospital room. The doctors explaining the severity of the burns. The realization that something invisible caused the worst damage. The parents sitting there, heartbroken, wishing they could rewind time by 30 seconds. It's the kind of memory that never fully fades. For those of us hearing it from the outside, it serves as a sobering reminder. Safety isn't just about obvious dangers. It's about understanding how quickly heat transfers, how materials retain it, how toddlers move unpredictably. And yet, even with that knowledge, what lingers most is empathy. Empathy for a parent who did not intend harm. Empathy for a child who was simply curious. Empathy for how fast life can change. There are no villains in this story, just a boiling pot, a curious toddler, and a moment that no one can undo. That's why it sticks. Because it could happen anywhere. Because it's ordinary. Because it reminds us how thin the line can be between a routine evening and a lifetime of memory shaped by a single second. And maybe that's why it gives people cold chills. Not because it's sensational, but because it feels real. Sorry to pause for just a moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope you're enjoying the calm so far. If you'd like more nights like this, true stories, gentle rain, no interruptions, please subscribe to Lacuna Noir. It really helps me keep creating these peaceful experiences for you. and tap the bell so you're here every time a new story arrives in the dark. Now, back to the story. A few years ago, after my dad's biological mother passed away, something happened that still feels strange when I think about it. She had been living in a nursing home during the final years of her life, so most of her belongings were not with her day to day. Instead, many of her old boxes and personal items had been stored in our shed. It was the kind of shed where things sit untouched for years, stacked in dusty corners, waiting for a time when someone finally decides to sort through them. After she died, my parents started going through her things. It was not an emotional process in the way you might expect. My dad had a complicated history with her. She had not raised him. There had been distance between them for most of his life. Still, going through a person's belongings after they pass always carries a certain weight. Every box feels like it might contain something meaningful or something you were never meant to see. One afternoon, I was at work when my mom texted me. She works in law enforcement, so she is not easily rattled. If anything unusual shows up in her life, she is usually calm and practical about it. That is why the pictures she sent me caught me off guard. The first image looked like something from a crime documentary. It was a human skull sitting inside what looked like an evidence bag. The second image showed two human jawbones. At first, I honestly thought it was some kind of joke. Maybe she was messing with me, or maybe they had found some Halloween decoration that looked realistic. But something about the way the bones were positioned, the texture of them, and the fact that she had already placed them in proper evidence bags told me this was not a prank. I texted her back, asking if this was real. She said yes. She told me they had found them in one of the boxes stored in the shed. She had immediately treated them like evidence, sealing them up carefully. The tone of her messages was serious, not playful. The rest of my workday felt long and distracted. My mind kept circling back to those images. A human skull is not something you expect to find among old clothing and family keepsakes. It is not something you casually stumble upon in a storage box. I tried to think of logical explanations. Maybe my grandmother had been involved in some kind of medical field. Maybe they were replicas. But my mom would know the difference. She deals with evidence and forensic materials regularly. When I got off work, I drove straight home. I went to the shed first. The boxes were spread out on the floor. Dust hung in the air from things being moved around after years of sitting untouched. My mom was there, gloves on, the evidence bags laid out on a table. She opened one of the bags carefully so I could see. It was real. The skull was aged but intact. The jawbones were separate. They were not plastic. They were not props. They were human remains. There is a strange silence that comes with seeing something like that. It is not like in movies where people scream or panic. It is more like your brain slows down, trying to process what you are looking at. You think about the fact that this once belonged to a person, someone who had lived, breathed, thought, and felt. The immediate question was obvious. Whose were they? And how did they end up in her belongings? We tried to piece together anything we knew about my dad's biological mother that might explain it. She had lived in different places over the years. She had moved around a lot. She had known many people. But nothing in her history suggested she had any professional reason to possess human remains. My mom contacted local authorities following proper procedure. Because of her background, she knew exactly how to handle it. The remains were taken in for examination. Forensic experts looked at them to determine age, origin, and whether there were signs of trauma. For a while, the situation felt surreal. It is one thing to hear about something unusual in someone else's family. It is another to have it sitting in your own shed. Eventually, our investigators suggested that the skull and jaw bones might be Native American in origin. That brought a whole different layer of concern. In the United States, Native American remains are treated with deep cultural and legal sensitivity. There are federal laws like the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act that govern how such remains must be handled and returned to tribes if possible. The theory that my grandmother may have stumbled across them came up during the investigation. It is possible she found them somewhere years ago, maybe during a move or on land that had historical significance, and for reasons we will never understand, decided to keep them. There was no clear evidence that she had committed any crime related to them. It did not appear to be connected to violence. There were no signs of recent damage or trauma. They seemed old. Still, the idea that someone would keep human remains in storage for years without telling anyone is unsettling. It raises questions you may never get answers to. Did she view them as curiosities? Did she understand what they were? Did she find them somewhere and simply not know what to do? There was a small article in the local newspaper about the discovery. It did not go into much detail, but it confirmed that human remains had been found in a storage shed after a woman's passing. Reading about something connected to your own family in the newspaper creates a strange distance. It becomes a story for the public, while still being personal for you. Friends and neighbors asked questions. Most were just curious. Some were clearly disturbed. It is not every day that someone in your community finds a skull in a shed. And for my dad, the situation brought up complicated emotions. His relationship with his biological mother had never been simple. Finding something so unusual among her belongings felt like another mystery added to a life that already held many unanswered questions. The investigation did not lead to dramatic conclusions. There were no arrests, no criminal charges. The remains were handled according to legal and cultural guidelines. Beyond that, the details faded into quiet paperwork and official reports. What stayed with me was not fear, but a sense of unresolved curiosity. Every object tells a story. A photograph shows a memory. A letter reveals thoughts, but a skull tells something deeper. It speaks to the reality that every life ends and that the remains deserve respect. Sometimes I think about how easily the box could have remained unopened for years longer. If we had not gone through those belongings when we did, the skull might still be sitting in that shed, forgotten, hidden in plain sight. The discovery changed the way I look at old belongings. You never truly know what someone has kept or why. Family history can hold secrets that do not fit neatly into the stories we tell ourselves. It also reminded me how important proper handling of human remains is, especially when cultural history may be involved. If they were Native American, then they belonged to a community and a heritage much larger than our family. Even now, years later, when I walk past that shed, I remember that day, the dust in the air, the evidence bags on the table, the quiet seriousness in my mom's voice. We never fully learned the story behind those bones. Maybe we never will. But the experience left a mark. It was not dramatic in the way crime shows portray discoveries. It was quiet, unsettling, and deeply human. It made me think about the lives that existed before mine, about the paths people take, and about how sometimes, long after someone is gone, pieces of their story still surface in unexpected ways. When I was younger, My great-grandmother used to tell stories that felt like they belonged to another world. She was in her 90s at the time, sharp in some ways, hazy in others, but when she talked about her childhood, her voice would change. It became steadier, almost distant, like she was stepping back into a different century. One story in particular always stayed with me. It was about a woman in her family, either her mother or her mother's sister. She could not quite remember which. What she did remember clearly was the accident. This would have happened before 1930, maybe even earlier. Rural Ohio at that time was very different from what people today might imagine. There were no highways like we have now, no ambulances rushing in minutes, no nearby trauma centers. Farms stretched out over miles of land, like dirt roads cut through fields. Railroads were essential. Trains carried goods, mail, and sometimes passengers, linking small farming communities to bigger towns. In those areas, the train tracks often ran close to homes or farmland. People crossed them on foot or by wagon regularly. There were not always warning gates or flashing lights. A whistle in the distance was often the only sign that a train was coming. According to my great-grandmother, the woman in question was near the tracks when the accident happened. The details were fuzzy. Maybe she was crossing. Maybe she slipped. Maybe she misjudged the speed of the train. But she was struck. Somehow she survived the initial impact. That alone feels almost impossible to imagine. Her leg, though, was severely mangled. My great-grandmother used the word shattered once. I then crushed. She said it was hanging by pieces that barely held it together. In those days, infection was a constant threat. Antibiotics did not exist yet. A badly crushed limb could easily mean death from infection if not treated quickly. There was no time to transport her far away. The nearest hospital might have been miles down rough roads. Even if they had managed to get her there, early 20th century hospitals in rural areas were limited in resources. So the decision was made to operate at home. They laid her out on the kitchen table. When my great-grandmother first told me that, I remember thinking it sounded exaggerated. But when you consider the time period, it was not as unusual as it seems today. In rural America, before modern emergency services, doctors often came to the house, and surgery could happen in living rooms or kitchens because that was where the space and light were. She said the kitchen table was cleared, sheets were laid down. Someone boiled water on the stove. The smell of wood smoke and metal filled the room. The family gathered outside or in nearby rooms, some praying, some crying quietly. It was not a sterile operating theater with bright lights and machines. It was a farmhouse kitchen with wooden floors and a coal or wood stove. The doctor, if there was one, would have had limited tools, maybe basic surgical instruments, maybe something as simple as a saw. My great-grandmother said they sawed her leg off, and she did not say it dramatically. She said it matter-of-factly, as if it were just something that had to be done. There was likely some form of anesthesia, perhaps ether or chloroform, though in rural settings the availability varied. It was not like modern anesthesia, where a patient is carefully monitored and fully unconscious. Even if she was partially sedated, the risk was enormous. Blood loss alone could have killed her. The family must have felt helpless standing by. Imagine hearing the sounds from the kitchen, the scrape of metal, the doctor giving instructions, someone holding her steady. In those times, family members often assisted because there were no surgical teams. And yet, she lived. That part of the story always surprised me. Not only did she survive being hit by a train, but she survived an emergency amputation in a farmhouse kitchen before the era of antibiotics. Recovery would not have been simple. Infection was still a serious threat in the days and weeks afterward. Wound care required constant attention. Clean bandages, boiled instruments, and vigilance were essential. Losing a leg in rural Ohio before 1930 also meant a permanent change in how she lived. There were no advanced prosthetics available locally. At best, she might have received a basic wooden prosthetic or crutches. Daily life on a farm required physical labor, walking long distances, working in fields, cooking, cleaning, hauling water. All of it became harder. My great-grandmother said she adapted. That is what people did back then. There was no long-term disability support, no structured rehabilitation programs. You either found a way to continue, or you relied entirely on family. What stands out to me now is how calmly my great-grandmother described it. For her generation, such events were tragic, but not extraordinary. Life was fragile. Medical care was limited. Accidents were part of existence, especially in agricultural communities. When she told the story, she would sometimes pause and try to remember if it was her mother or her aunt. Memory blends over 90 years. But the image of the kitchen table never changed. That detail remained clear in her mind. Today, if someone were hit by a train and survived, they would be rushed by ambulance to a trauma center. Surgeons with advanced equipment would operate in sterile rooms. Blood transfusions would be given. Antibiotics would prevent infection. The contrast between now and then feels enormous. Yet in that farmhouse kitchen, people did what they could with what they had. It was not about comfort, it was about survival. There was no other option. And I sometimes think about how stories like that fade with time. They exist only because someone remembers and tells them. There are no hospital records easily accessible. No newspaper clippings we have found. Just a 92-year-old woman recalling something that happened before she was even born. There is something powerful about those oral histories. They connect us to a time when communities relied heavily on each other, when doctors traveled by horse or early automobiles, when surgery could happen in a room that later returned to being a place for family dinners. Whenever I hear modern debates about healthcare access or emergency response times, I think about that kitchen table, about how far medical science has come, about how much risk people once faced in everyday life. It also reminds me that resilience runs deep in family stories. The woman who lost her leg did not give up. She lived on. She likely raised children, cooked meals, and continued her life despite a disability that would have been incredibly challenging at that time. My great-grandmother has since passed away. With her, many details of that era have gone. But that story remains. It is not dramatic in a cinematic way. It is quiet and raw. A train, a mangled leg, a farmhouse kitchen, a saw, and a woman who survived against overwhelming odds. In a way, it feels like a small window into early 20th century America, especially in rural states like Ohio. It shows both the harshness of life and the strength of people who endured it. And every time I picture that kitchen table, I think about how ordinary it must have looked the next morning, as if nothing had happened, while carrying the weight of what it had witnessed. When I was a kid, there was a house in our town that everyone called the Castle. It wasn't actually a castle, of course. It was just a big, old house built in a style that looked different from the rest of the neighborhood. It had a tall stone tower rising up from one corner, narrow windows and a steep roof that made it look like something out of a fairy tale. Compared to the plain brick homes and ranch-style houses nearby, it stood out. To a child's eyes, it felt mysterious, almost magical. My dad used to drive us past it sometimes. We never went inside. We never even stopped for long. He would slow the car down just enough for us to get a good look. The tower always caught my attention first. I would imagine someone standing up there, looking down at the street below. The place had an eerie silence around it, not like it was holding on to secrets. My dad leaned into that feeling. If my siblings and I were acting up in the back seat, he would half-jokingly say, "If you don't behave, I'll take you to the castle." His voice would get just serious enough to make us freeze. As kids, we believed him. We didn't know what he meant exactly, but the way he said it made it sound like a place where bad things happened to children who didn't listen. He told us that someone had died there. That was enough to keep us quiet for at least a few minutes. The threat wasn't cruel. It wasn't screamed. It was delivered with that playful tone parents use when they want to scare you just enough to get your attention. We would press our faces to the windows as we passed, trying to see movement in the tower or shadows behind the glass. In my mind, the house felt alive. It wasn't just wood and stone. It was a character in the story of our childhood. As I grew older, the mystery slowly turned into curiosity. I started asking questions. At first, my dad brushed them off. He would shrug or say, "Just an old story." But the older I got, the more I realized there was something real behind it. Kids at school talked about the house too. Everyone seemed to know a version of the story, but no two versions were exactly the same. Eventually, I learned the truth, or at least as close to the truth as small-town history allows. Years before I was born, a man who lived in that house had killed his wife. It wasn't some vague rumor. It had happened. The details were disturbing. He had used a chainsaw. Afterward, he had disposed of her remains in the river. Her body was discovered by a fisherman days later. The story spread quickly through the community and stayed there, embedded in local memory. Hearing that as a teenager was different than hearing that someone died there as a child. The reality carried weight. The house no longer felt like a spooky fairy tale setting. It felt heavy. Real people had lived there. Real violence had happened within those walls. The tower I once imagined as a lookout post for some mysterious figure now seemed like it had silently watched something terrible unfold. I remember driving past it alone for the first time after learning the full story. I slowed down the way my dad used to. The house looked smaller than it had when I was young, less magical, more worn. The tower was still there, but it didn't feel enchanted anymore. It felt like a reminder that bad things can happen anywhere, even in places that look beautiful from the outside. As unsettling as the story was, the memory of my dad's voice in the car always overpowered the darkness. I can still hear him saying, "You better behave, or we're going to the castle." There was a rhythm to it, a slight smile at the corner of his mouth. He wasn't trying to traumatize us. He was being playful in that slightly dramatic way parents sometimes are. Back then, the castle felt like a place of punishment. Now it feels like a snapshot of childhood. It represents long car rides, the sound of the engine humming, the smell of my dad's aftershave faint in the front seat. It represents a time when the world felt bigger and stranger, when buildings could hold legends and parents could control monsters with a sentence. After my dad passed away, I found myself thinking about the castle more often. Grief does strange things. It attaches itself to ordinary memories and makes them glow differently. What once felt scary now feels precious. The house is still there. I've driven past it a few times as an adult. The tower hasn't changed much. The stone looks older. The windows reflect the sky the same way they always did. I no longer see it as a place of horror. I see it as a place tied to my father. It's funny how that works. A location marked by violence can also be marked by laughter in your own memory. The two realities exist side by side. The tragedy that happened there is real and cannot be erased. But so is the image of my dad glancing at us in the rearview mirror, pretending to be stern. As a child, I believed that if we were bad enough, why, he might actually turn the car into that driveway and make us face whatever haunted the tower. As an adult, I know he never would have. It was just a tool, a bit of storytelling to keep us in line. But it worked. The castle became our family's inside reference point. We didn't need to explain it to each other. We just knew. Small towns have a way of holding on to stories like that. They get passed down, reshaped slightly with each retelling. The fisherman who found the remains became almost mythical in the way people described him. The river took on a darker tone. The house stood as a landmark not just because of its architecture, but because of what had happened there. For me, though, the strongest memory isn't the crime. It's the feeling of being a kid in the back seat, watching the tower slide by outside the window. It's the mixture of fear and fascination. The way I would sit up straighter when my dad mentioned it. The way my siblings and I would whisper about it later, building up the legend even more in our imaginations. Now that he's gone, I would give anything to hear him tease us about the castle one more time. Grief has a way of softening edges. The house doesn't scare me anymore. It feels almost comforting. Not because of what happened there, but because of who I was when I first saw it. Because of who was sitting in the driver's seat. It's strange how memory works. A place tied to something violent can become sentimental simply because of the context in which you experienced it. When I think of the castle, I don't picture the crime scene. I picture sunlight hitting the stone walls. I picture my dad's hands on the steering wheel. I picture my younger self believing that towers held secrets and that fathers could protect you from whatever lived inside them. Sometimes I wonder what it would have been like to grow up without that story, without the playful warning. Would the house have just been another interesting building? Probably. But because of my dad, it became something more. It became part of our family narrative, woven into childhood discipline and imagination. Even now, years later, if someone mentions that house, I don't immediately think of the chainsaw or the river. I think of my dad's voice. I think of how safe I felt, even while pretending to be scared. I think of how he used storytelling as a gentle way to shape our behavior, turning a dark local history into something that felt almost theatrical. The castle still stands. People drive past it every day without knowing the full story. Some might know the crime, others might just see an unusual house with a tower. For me, it will always be layered. It holds a tragedy I learned about later, and it holds a piece of my childhood that I can never get back. What used to frighten me has become something softer. It's a reminder of how parents create small myths to guide their children. It's a reminder of long drives and shared glances in the rearview mirror. And most of all, it's a reminder of my dad. The house may have once been the setting of something terrible, but in my memory, it's also the setting of something tender. A father trying to keep his kids in line, a car full of laughter and nervous giggles, a tower that looked enormous when I was small, and now seems modest when I pass it as an adult. Grief turns places into monuments, not official ones with plaques, but personal ones. For me, the castle is one of those monuments. It stands quietly, holding both darkness and light, and every time I think of it, I don't feel fear anymore. I feel gratitude for the memories attached to it, and for the man who made it part of my story. About 10 years ago, something happened that shook my family in a way I still struggle to explain. It didn't happen directly to us, but it touched us closely enough that the shock rippled through our lives. My brother received a frantic phone call early one morning from his best friend, Eric. The kind of call where you can tell immediately something is very wrong. Eric was panicked. His voice was shaking. He wasn't speaking in full sentences at first, just fragments of concern. Eric's younger brother, Carl, had called him earlier that morning. According to Eric, Carl sounded completely different from himself. He was talking rapidly, almost breathlessly. He said he was seeing the light. He said he finally understood God's true purpose for him. He spoke about revelation, destiny, and being chosen. None of it made sense. Carl had never been deeply religious before. He wasn't known for dramatic spiritual experiences. So when he started speaking like that, Eric felt something was off immediately. Eric tried to calm him down during that call. He asked simple questions. Where are you? Are you okay? Did something happen? But Carl's answers were scattered. He kept repeating phrases about divine purpose and truth. Then the call ended abruptly. After that, Eric couldn't get him back on the phone. That's when Eric called my brother. They had grown up together. They trusted each other with everything. Eric asked my brother to try calling Carl, thinking maybe he would answer someone else. Sometimes, when someone is spiraling, a different voice can break through. My brother dialed Carl's number multiple times. It went straight to voicemail. At that point, no one knew what was happening. They were worried about a mental health crisis, maybe a breakdown, maybe something frightening but manageable. No one imagined what had already taken place. Later that morning, the reality came out in fragments, first through police reports and then through stunned phone calls. Carl had made a decision that morning under the belief that God was commanding him to act. In his state of delusion, he believed he was carrying out divine instruction. He attacked his mother in their home kitchen. The violence that followed was unimaginable. By the time Eric and my brother were trying to reach him, Carl had already killed his mother. Afterward, in a state that police later described as severely psychotic, he remained in the house. He placed his mother's severed head into a plastic bag and set it on the porch. The details are difficult to process even now. It wasn't rage in the way we usually understand it. It wasn't a fight that escalated. It was something else entirely. Something driven by a mind that had broken from reality. What makes it even more surreal is what happened next. After sitting outside for a period of time, Carl noticed the neighbor's car idling nearby. The neighbor may have been warming it up or preparing to leave. In his detached state, Carl walked over, got into the car, and drove away. There was no clear plan. He drove until he eventually crashed the vehicle on a highway. When police arrived at the crash scene, they found him shaken, but alive. According to reports, he confessed almost immediately. He told officers what he had done. He spoke about God, about purpose, about revelation. He described the events in a way that suggested he believed he had been fulfilling a divine mission. Officers later returned to the house and found the plastic bag on the porch. For my brother and Eric, the timeline of that day felt unreal. Just hours earlier, they had been trying to reach Carl, hoping to calm him down. They had no idea they were already too late. Eric lost his mother that morning in a way no one could have predicted. My brother lost the sense of normalcy that comes with believing you understand the people around you. Carl was evaluated and later deemed legally insane. Doctors determined he had experienced a severe psychotic episode. He was not considered criminally responsible in the traditional sense because his mind had detached so completely from reality that he could not distinguish right from wrong at the time of the act. He was committed to a secure psychiatric hospital rather than sent to prison. That decision sparked complicated emotions for many people who knew the family. On one hand, mental illness is real. Psychosis can distort perception so deeply that someone genuinely believes something impossible or terrifying is true. On the other hand, a woman had lost her life. A family had been destroyed. The word insane doesn't soften that. Eric's life changed permanently that day. Grief is always hard, but grief mixed with shock and confusion carries a different weight. He wasn't mourning an accident or an illness. He was mourning a violent act committed by his own brother. That kind of loss is layered. There is sadness, anger, disbelief, and sometimes guilt. People wonder if they missed warning signs. They replay conversations. They ask themselves if they could have stopped it. My brother struggled too in his own way. He had been asked to call Carl. He had tried. It's irrational. But when something terrible happens, people often search for tiny moments where the outcome might have shifted. If Carl had answered the phone, if someone had gone to the house sooner, if Eric had driven over immediately. But the truth is that psychotic breaks can move fast and unpredictably. By the time someone begins speaking about divine missions in an erratic tone, they may already be far gone. Carl remained in a psychiatric facility for years. Our treatment in such institutions focuses on stabilization, medication, and ongoing evaluation. He was not simply placed in a room and forgotten. He was monitored. Doctors assessed whether he understood what had happened. They measured his risk. They tracked his progress. Recently, after about a decade, he was released under strict supervision. For many, that news brought mixed reactions. Some believe that once someone commits an act like that, they should never return to society. Others point to the role of mental illness and argue that if someone is no longer psychotic and no longer a danger, they deserve a structured second chance. It's a complicated debate, especially in countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada, where mental health law intersects with criminal law in very specific ways. For Eric, the release reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Even if doctors say someone is stable, memories do not disappear. The image of that morning remains frozen in time. The phone call, the unanswered ringing, the police confirmation. Grief does not operate on a legal timeline. What stands out most about this story is how ordinary it seemed at the start. A brother calling another brother, concern over strange behavior, a request for help. There were no obvious signs in the years before that something so extreme was coming. Mental illness can hide quietly until it erupts. It also raises questions about how society handles early warning signs. If someone begins speaking about divine purpose in a frantic, detached way, what resources exist? Could emergency intervention have happened faster? In many Western countries, involuntary psychiatric holds require clear evidence of danger. But danger can escalate in minutes. This story is not just about violence. It is about how fragile the human mind can be. When reality fractures, actions that once seemed impossible can suddenly feel justified to the person experiencing the break. That doesn't excuse the harm. It explains the mechanism behind it. For my brother, that day changed how he thinks about mental health. It changed how he responds when someone speaks in extreme religious or paranoid language. It made him more alert, more cautious. It reminded him that beneath everyday routines, people can carry invisible battles. 10 years later, the memory still feels sharp. The phone call echoes. The sense of helplessness lingers. It's one of those events that splits life into before and after. Before that day, Carl was just Eric's younger brother. After that day, he became something else entirely in the public record. Yet even now, the story feels tragic more than monstrous. Tragic because a mother lost her life. Tragic because a family was shattered. Tragic because a mind broke so completely that it led to irreversible harm. The release of Carl this year does not erase the past. It doesn't restore what was taken. But it does force everyone connected to the story to confront difficult questions about forgiveness, risk, and the limits of treatment. Can someone who committed violence under psychosis live safely again? Can families ever feel at peace? There are no simple answers. What remains is the memory of that frantic morning call. A reminder that sometimes the first sign of disaster is a trembling voice on the other end of the line, asking for help before anyone understands how urgent it truly is. There's a house just down the road from where I grew up that still feels different when I walk past it. It's not abandoned. It's not falling apart. From the outside, it looks like any other home on the street. Clean walls, a gate out front, windows that catch the light in the afternoon. But for years, whenever someone mentioned that house, voices would lower slightly. People would pause before continuing. It carried a story that never quite left the neighborhood. The house had been built many years before I was old enough to understand much about construction or timelines. To me, as a kid, it was just another building that had always been there. Families had lived in it, cars parked in the driveway, laundry sometimes hung out to dry. Nothing about it suggested anything unusual. It blended in with the rest of the homes on the road. Then, a few years after it had been occupied by one particular family, something strange began to happen. The residents started noticing a persistent blockage in their drain. At first, it seemed like a typical plumbing problem. Maybe grease buildup, maybe debris. Anyone who has lived in a house long enough knows that drains clog from time to time. You call someone to snake it out, pour in chemicals, or try to flush it through. But this wasn't resolving. Along with the blockage came a foul smell. Not just the unpleasant odor of standing water, but something stronger. Something that lingered. The kind of smell that doesn't disappear when you open windows or spray air freshener. It clung to the air around the back of the house. Eventually, the problem became serious enough that they had to dig up part of the drainage line. I can imagine the scene now, even though I didn't witness it myself. Workers arriving with tools, concrete being broken open, earth being moved aside. The assumption probably still was that this was a structural issue, roots growing into pipes, perhaps, or a collapsed section of old drainage. What they found instead changed how everyone on our street looked at that house. Inside the drain passage beneath the ground, they discovered human remains, a half-decomposed body of a woman. The shock must have been overwhelming. What started as a plumbing issue turned into a police investigation in an instant. The smell that had bothered the family was no longer just a nuisance, it was evidence. As the story unfolded, and it became clear that the remains belonged to the wife of one of the construction workers who had been involved when the house was originally built years earlier. Somehow, during or around that time, she had gone missing. Whether people connected the disappearance to the construction site back then, I don't know. But her body had been concealed within the drainage system of the very house her husband had helped build. When I first heard this story, I was just a small boy. I didn't fully understand what half-decomposed meant. I didn't ask detailed questions. I just knew that a body had been found underground in a house near mine. That alone was enough to stir my imagination. As children, we often fill in gaps with exaggerated fears. The idea that someone had been hidden beneath a house, unnoticed for years, felt terrifying. I remember avoiding looking too closely at the gate when I walked past. I would cross to the other side of the street just in case. The house seemed darker to me after that, even if the sun was shining directly on it. What made it even more unsettling was the thought that people had been living above that space all that time, cooking meals, sleeping at night, celebrating birthdays, completely unaware of what lay beneath their floors. It challenged the way I thought about safety and familiarity. A home is supposed to be the safest place in the world. The idea that it could hide something like that felt wrong. As I grew older, the fear shifted into curiosity. I began to wonder about the timeline. How had the body ended up there? Did anyone suspect the construction worker at the time? Was there a missing person report? Did neighbors notice anything unusual back then? These were questions I didn't have the courage to ask as a child, but now they linger in my mind. Small communities often hold on to stories like this. They become part of local memory. Not something discussed every day, but something that resurfaces during conversations about strange events or when someone new moves into the neighborhood. It's the kind of story that makes people say, "You know what happened in that house, right?" I also think about the family who discovered it. They didn't ask for that trauma. They were simply dealing with a blocked drain. Instead, they became connected forever to a crime scene. The shock of learning that your plumbing issue is actually tied to a human body must be something that stays with you. And there's something deeply unsettling about remains being hidden within infrastructure. Inside walls, under floors, within drains. It blurs the line between the everyday and the unthinkable. Drains are part of the background of our lives. We don't think about them. They're meant to carry things away quietly. The idea that one could conceal something so serious changes how you see ordinary spaces. Looking back now, I realize that the story also says something about time. Years passed before the discovery. Seasons changed. Families moved in and out. Children played nearby. And all along, the truth was buried beneath the surface. It reminds me that the past doesn't always stay in the past. Sometimes it resurfaces in the most unexpected ways. As an adult, I don't see the house as haunted or cursed the way I might have imagined as a child. I see it as a place marked by tragedy. A woman whose life ended in violence, a crime that may have gone unnoticed for too long, and a reminder that even familiar streets can hold hidden histories. I sometimes think about walking past it now and asking my neighbors for more details, like you mentioned. Not out of morbid curiosity, but to understand the full story. To know who she was. To know whether justice was served. Did her husband face consequences? Was the truth uncovered fully? Or are there still unanswered questions? Stories like this linger because they disrupt our sense of normalcy. They force us to acknowledge that beneath the surface of routine life, darker realities can exist. Yet they also remind us of something else. Truth has a way of emerging, even after years underground, even beneath concrete and pipes. It eventually comes to light. For me, that house will always carry two layers of memory. One is the image from childhood, me walking quickly past, heart beating a little faster. The other is the adult perspective, understanding that what happened there was not a ghost story, but a human one. A story of loss, concealment, and discovery. And maybe that's why it stays with you. Not because of the gory details you avoided as a child, but because of the quiet realization that ordinary places are not always as simple as they seem. Sometimes, beneath the most normal-looking homes, there are stories waiting to be uncovered. The story of the Dyatlov Pass incident has fascinated people for decades, and it's easy to understand why. It has all the elements of a true mystery: experienced hikers, a remote mountain range, a campsite abandoned in the middle of the night, and a string of details that don't seem to fit neatly together. Even today, more than 60 years later, it continues to spark debate across the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and beyond. In late January 1959, 10 young hikers from the Ural Polytechnical Institute set out on what was meant to be a challenging but achievable winter expedition in the Ural Mountains of the former Soviet Union. They were not reckless adventurers. They were trained, capable, and disciplined. The leader of the group was 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, an engineering student with significant hiking experience. The group members were seeking to earn their Grade 3 hiking certification, which at the time was the highest level of trekking qualification in the Soviet Union. The hike was ambitious, but not extraordinary for people with their level of skill. They were planning to traverse a remote stretch of the northern Ural Mountains, skiing across snow-covered terrain in deep winter conditions. Temperatures in that region during February can drop well below freezing, with strong winds and limited visibility. Still, these were experienced hikers. They knew how to handle winter expeditions. They carried proper gear, planned their route carefully, and kept journals documenting their progress. Shortly before reaching their final destination, one of the hikers, Yuri Yudin, turned back due to illness. He had been struggling with joint pain and fatigue, and continuing in such harsh conditions would have been risky. It was a practical decision. He returned home, likely disappointed, but assuming he would see his friends again soon. He would later become the only member of the group to survive. The remaining 9 continued toward a mountain known locally as Kholat Shachol. In the language of the indigenous Mansi people, the name translates to something like Dead Mountain. The name alone adds a layer of unease, though it likely referred to the lack of wildlife in the area rather than anything supernatural. On February 1st, 1959, the hikers set up camp on the exposed slope of this mountain rather than moving down into a more sheltered forested area. That decision has been debated ever since. Some believe poor visibility led them slightly off course. Others suggest they intentionally camped on the slope to practice setting up in harsh conditions. According to their plan, the group was supposed to send a telegram to the Ural Polytechnical Institute once they returned to a populated area. The expected date for that message was around 12 to 18 February, depending on travel time. When no telegram arrived, it wasn't immediately alarming. Delays were common. Remote winter expeditions rarely followed an exact schedule. But as more days passed without word, concern began to grow. Eventually, a search party was organized. Fellow students and instructors began combing the area where the group was last known to be traveling. What they found has puzzled investigators ever since. The tent was discovered first. It was still standing in part, partially covered by snow. What made it strange was that it had been slashed open from the inside. Instead of exiting through the normal flap, someone had cut their way out. Inside the tent were their belongings: boots, coats, equipment, food. It appeared that the hikers had left suddenly, in the middle of the night, without properly dressing for the extreme cold. Footprints in the snow showed that the group had walked, not run, down the slope toward a nearby forested area. The tracks indicated they were barefoot or wearing only socks. In sub-zero Siberian temperatures, that detail alone is chilling. Why would trained hikers leave the safety of their tent in darkness with inadequate clothing? Under a large Siberian pine tree, searchers found the first two bodies. They were lying near the remains of a small fire. They were wearing little more than underwear. And the branches of the tree were broken up to several feet high, suggesting that at least one of them had climbed it. Investigators speculated that they might have climbed to look back toward the tent or to assess danger. Between the pine tree and the campsite, 3 more bodies were discovered, including Igor Dyatlov. They appeared to have been attempting to return to the tent. Their positioning suggested movement uphill, as if they had decided to go back for gear or shelter. All 5 of these hikers were determined to have died primarily from hypothermia. The remaining 4 hikers were not found till nearly 2 months later. They were discovered under about 4 meters of snow in a ravine, roughly 75 meters from the pine tree. Unlike the others, these 4 were more fully clothed. It appeared that they had taken garments from the bodies of their companions in an effort to survive longer. That detail suggests rational survival behavior rather than panic or chaos. However, some of these 4 had severe internal injuries: fractured ribs, skull damage. The injuries were described as comparable to those from a high-impact car crash, yet there were no external wounds that matched such force. There were no signs of a struggle with other humans, no clear evidence of weapons. Then there was another unsettling detail. Traces of radiation were reportedly found on some of their clothing. This fact has fueled speculation for decades. Why would investigators even test for radiation in a hiking accident? Some of the hikers had previously worked in environments where radiation exposure was possible, which may partly explain the testing. But to many, it seemed to suggest something larger. Adding to the mystery were reports from other groups in the region. Some hikers about 50 kilometers away claimed to have seen strange orange spheres in the sky around the same time. Military and meteorological personnel also reported unusual lights. In the Cold War era, when secrecy surrounded military testing, it was not unreasonable for people to suspect weapons tests or experimental devices. One theory suggests that military testing in the area may have startled the hikers, causing them to cut open their tent and flee. The sound of explosions or shock waves could have been terrifying in the dark, especially on an exposed mountain slope. Another theory proposes that a small avalanche occurred, though the slope was not particularly steep. A slab of snow pressing against the tent could have made them believe they were in immediate danger, prompting a rapid evacuation. There are also more dramatic theories involving secret weapons, parachute mines, infrasound-induced panic, and even extraterrestrial involvement. The orange spheres in the sky are often cited in these explanations. But as with many mysteries, the most extraordinary theories tend to attract the most attention. In 2019 and 2020, Russian authorities reopened the case and concluded that a natural event, most likely a small avalanche or snow slab, triggered the hikers' decision to leave the tent. According to this explanation, the group may have feared a larger slide and temporarily retreated to the forest. In the extreme cold and darkness, without proper gear, their situation quickly became fatal. The injuries to the last 4 could have occurred when they fell into the ravine, compounded by the weight of snow. For many, however, that explanation still leaves unanswered questions. Why the radiation? Why the strange lights? Why the unusual pattern of injuries? Part of what keeps the Dyatlov Pass incident alive in public imagination is that every answer seems to create new questions. What makes the case especially compelling for Western audiences is the context. It happened during the Cold War in the Soviet Union, where government transparency was limited. Records were sometimes incomplete. Investigations were controlled. That atmosphere of secrecy makes people wonder whether all details were fully disclosed. Yet beneath the theories, the human tragedy remains central. These were young people in their early 20s, ambitious and adventurous. They kept diaries. They joked in photographs. They posed smiling in the snow. They were friends on a shared challenge. Yuri Yudin, the one who turned back, carried the weight of survival for the rest of his life. He often expressed sorrow that illness had saved him while his friends perished. The Dyatlov Pass incident endures not just because of mystery, but because it captures something deeply unsettling. Capable, intelligent people making decisions in extreme conditions that ended in disaster. Whether the cause was natural forces, military testing, or a combination of factors, it unfolded in a way that still feels strange and incomplete. In the end, there is no definitive answer that satisfies everyone. Official conclusions lean toward natural causes. Public imagination continues to explore darker possibilities. The mountain remains. The snow still falls there every winter. And the story of those 9 hikers cutting their way out of a tent into the freezing night continues to echo through time as one of the most haunting unsolved cases of the 20th century. Look, if you're still watching, you already know what this channel is. No jump scares, no fake drama, just real stories about real people who survived things most of us can't even imagine. And that's scarier than any movie could ever be. If you want more of this raw, unfiltered truth, told the way it deserves to be told, subscribe to Lacuna Noir. We're not here to waste your time. We're here to tell the stories that actually matter. Thanks for listening. Now go get some sleep, if you can.